Christ our Lord. Amen. Almighty God, we pray for the Parliament of Barbados, especially the Senate at this time assembled, that thou would prosper all their counsel advancement to the glory and welfare of thy people and the honor and welfare through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Let us say together the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive them that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. And may the grace of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, and the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be upon us now and forevermore. Amen.
The Senate is now in session.
Messages from Her Excellency the Governor General. Announcements by Your Honor the President.
I have been in contact with Senator Moore, who continues to be on ILO business in Geneva, so she will not be here with us today. I've also heard from Senator Maynard, who is attending to an emergency and is likely to be joining us late. I'm to advise too that we have the minutes of the meeting held on March 13th and March 4th. They have been circulated. I hope everyone has had a look at them. And I'm ready to receive a resolution that they be confirmed. Minutes of the 6th and 13th of March.
Mr. President, I'd like to move that the minutes of the 6th and 13th of March be confirmed.
The question is that the minutes of the 6th and 13th of March this year be now confirmed. All honorable members in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
Presentation of petitions, presentation of papers, reports from select committees, questions to ministers, request for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance, statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries, personal explanations, motions related to the business or sittings of the Senate, and moved by a minister.
Mr. President, I beg to move that standing orders 22-1 and 45-2 be suspended for the remainder of today's sitting.
Question is that standing orders 22-1 and 45-2 be suspended for the balance of the sitting. All honorable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. The mentioned standing orders are now suspended for the balance of today's sitting.
Introduction of bills.
Mr. President, I beg to give notice of the following bills. Control of Disposable Plastics Bill 2019, Appropriation Bill 2019, and to give a notice of a resolution to allow the government to issue to Sagicor Life Inc. from promissory notes in the amount of $8.5 million to facilitate the preservation of the pension plans of 72 employees of British American Insurance Company, Barbados Limited. Mr. President, I beg to move the first reading of the Control of Disposable Plastics Bill 2019 and to give notice of the first reading of the Appropriation Bill 2019.
The question is that disposal of the Control of Disposable Plastics Bill 2019 we now read the first time.
Two bills. And the Appropriation Bill.
I think we should do them separately. Further question is that the Appropriation Bill 2019 be now read for a second time. First time, I'm sorry. First time. All honourable members in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it. You ready to pose it? I guess so.
Public business. Order number 3. In the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the Appropriation Bill 2019.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I'm indeed pleased to rise this morning to lead off debate on the Appropriation Bill 2019. Mr. President, as you would appreciate, this is the first appropriation bill which is being debated by this session of this Honourable's chamber. I think members would recognize that it is probably the most important one of the most important bills that comes before the Senate, this Honourable chamber, annually. And I'm certainly looking forward to a very exciting, enlightening debate. I believe some members, one or two, have already spoken about the aspects of the appropriation bill, that being the budget, in terms of dismissing aspects of it of not being relevant or of interest to the poor people. And I'm certainly hoping that by the end of these 3 days, Mr. President, with your guidance, that honourable member, whoever he or she may be, would form a different impression, perhaps if not completely different. We understand the nature of mankind in terms of positions that they take from time to time and why these positions are taken. But as I said, Mr. President, it is actually a constitutional requirement under Section 109 of our Constitution that there must be an appropriation bill which shall be debated, and it specifies in terms of the standing orders of the House of Assembly. Order 64-1 speaks in terms of the appropriation bill and when it should be debated. Mr. President, in the estimates document, I only see a couple around the table today. Traditionally, you normally see these large documents. but I believe members have now have moved to the technology which they're utilizing voraciously. And it speaks initially in that the purpose of the estimates document, the 2019-2020 estimates, it sets out the details of the operating and capital spending requirements of ministries for the fiscal year commencing April the 1st, 2019. These estimates are not cast in stone, but should be realistic and achievable in terms of the revenue and the expenditure projections. And I think historically we recognize that there are sometimes changes in terms of the projections, be it revenue, or especially in terms of revenue, where sometimes governments in the past have tended to overestimate, so to speak, if I can use that term, in terms of the revenue, and conversely have reduced the expenditure because, Mr. President, it made the overall picture look better than it really was. This year has seen a variation of the process. Traditionally, it was debated in the other chamber, and then it came here. But this year we saw a change, the first time a change in this process since independence, where we have adopted in Barbados a system which is used in some other countries in the Caribbean and certainly in the Commonwealth, where after the laying of the appropriation bill, the estimates, ministers are invited to come to the lower house, and in Barbados with their officials, to answer questions from their colleague ministers and indeed from the leader of the opposition regarding the administration programs in their ministries, ideally linked to the expenditure requirements as laid out in the estimates. And as part of the process this year, for the first time, we had the Prime Minister delivering the budgetary statement as part of the process. In other words, the estimate speaks of revenue expected and over the years and expenditure. And then traditionally you would have a budget speech sometime late in the year, sometimes not in that year, speaking in terms of how the government was planning to raise the revenue that would be needed. And this year, it's part of the change, that budget speech has been included as a second reading speech in the other chamber in the appropriation bill. And so it has made the entire discourse much more interesting, much more enlightening from the point of view, certainly in terms of what transpired with the questioning of the various ministries, and indeed by the provision of the budget as part of the process, which has allowed members, not the leader of the opposition in here, Mr. President, to omit the estimates and indeed focus on the budget speech, which makes it all the more easy for anyone. But, Mr. President, I will elaborate in terms of the estimates later. Mr. President, the elections are over. A new government is in place. But I must reflect, I have no apologies to anyone on the state in which this country was left after 10 years of the DLP mismanagement, misrule, corruption, and misery which it brought to thousands of Barbadians. Mr. President, the story has to be told. It has to be. Mismanagement which resulted in our economy being in a perilous state, and our society in danger of disintegrating. Now, we have seen it. The spectacle of overflowing sewage on the South Coast, with ministers dithering in spite of having the appropriate and relevant information 2 years in advance and doing nothing. Roads in a deplorable state across the entire island. And we had a minister, or ministers of transport and works, more obsessed with painting car park spaces where they could park their vehicle and where staff should not park. And Mr. President, I'm not addressing anyone in here or any relative of anyone in this honorable chamber this morning, Mr. President. Sad situation of commuters waiting for several hours to get buses, not knowing when they would come, where we had the scandal of contracts being issued to Trinidadians and to entities within Barbados to repair buses for millions of dollars, buses which were never repaired, but coincidentally, ministers were driving vehicles belonging to that same entity. So these things have to be spoken about. Old age pensions, struggling, going to polyclinics to get medication since the imposition of user fees, often turned away because of stockouts and unavailability of medicines. And Mr. President, this resulted across this country in a feeling of hopelessness and gloom across this entire country. And Mr. President, this is the state of affairs that obtained after 10 years of the Democratic Labour Party. And the irony, Mr. President, was that this was the end result of a government, and I know there are no supporters in here, Mr. President. I know that there are no honourable senators in here or members of any political entity called the Democratic Labour Party. And this was the end result of a DLP government that promised that they would not lie, cheat, or steal, that promised good governance and absolute transparency, that promised pathways to progress. And we in Barbados are still wondering pathways to progress for whom, or for which minister or ministers who before 2007 had their locks changed for inability to pay the rent, but now have become property magnates, plural, property magnates, and live in massive properties and have sports bars and other places of entertainment and drive expensive cars and boast about 5 and 6 cars in the garage. That is what I'm speaking about. And this same group was strident in saying that the economy was stable and was ready to take off in January 2013 on the eve of an election. They promised that jobs would be secure, but then sent home thousands. They promised that university students would not have to pay tuition fees. Mr. President, we know the outcome of that. Mr. President, what that group did to Barbados must never be forgotten. Must never be forgotten. And there, well, I shouldn't say there, members of the second 11 of the DLP, in another place I would describe it as slough, are speaking, have the temerity to come out and speak and question the management of the economy and the affairs of this country. Mr. President, it is incredulous. But enough on that for today. What the new government has been able to do since coming to office on the 25th of May, 2018, Mr. President, we need to speak about. I've painted a picture of the situation that it was. Indeed, I'm not going to get into the details of the situation. There's time for that. There'll be volumes written about that in due course. But the government recognized that there was a need to act urgently to address the situation in this country. There was a need for economic stabilization. There was a need to prepare for growth and transformation of our economy and the entire society. They embarked on a project, the Barbados Economic Recovery and Transformation Program, which my colleague calls it the BERT program. I don't know. I'm confused. Sometimes it's Bernie and Bert. Sometimes it is the PPP for FDD. I don't know what that is. That is some entity to which he belongs, which cannot decide yet on if it is fish, fowl, red herring, or indeed a political party. Mr. President, the foreign reserves, which stood at approximately $400 million in June 2018, now stand at $1.1 billion. from a situation where there was 6 weeks of imports, board also, to a situation where it now covers 15 weeks of imports. Mr. President, in spite of the naysayers who speak about growth but are happiest when dealing with the blue economy, the domestic debt restructuring of 80% of our debt, $11.9 million, led to the GDP going from 175% to 125% now as we speak, and declining. And I'm sure that that honorable senator, she is delighted at this stage of this economic and recovery. Though being not everything that is expected to be, everything that she would expect it to be, and recognizing, of course, that we don't live in a perfect world. The IMF gave the approval to the BERT program, and we were able to sign on to an extended fund facility, which would make $291 million available to us. We gave to the public servants, to the delight of the Leader of the Opposition, a 5% increase. We also reintroduced the payment of tuition fees for university students. And we increased the minimum non-contributory and minimum contributory pensions. There's the trust loans program to assist small entrepreneurs. And we have made tremendous progress in addressing the South Coast sewage problem, Mr. President. I believe you would be aware of the offensive stench in the situation in which that part of Barbados was only a few months ago. And indeed, through the hard work and the determination of the members of the staff of the Barbados Water Authority, and with assistance from some consultants, that we have been able to remedy the situation. It is not completely sorted out. There's still a lot of work to be done in that process, and I will speak to that briefly later on. Mr. President, most regrettably, as part of this process of stabilization and improving the economic situation, regrettably, a number of persons have lost their jobs. This is, as I said, is regretted, but government has tried to make the suffering, to ease the strain, so to speak, and has established a household mitigation unit, and is looking also in terms of the retraining of these persons so that they can be employed in other aspects of the country and society to make their contribution. Mr. President, in terms of the estimates, a general overview of the estimates, honorable members would see on page 1 of the estimates document that it speaks of a review of the estimates for the fiscal year 2018-2019. And it speaks to the revised estimates of expenditure and of revenue. And that is detailed there. What I can say is that these estimates, if you look on page 2, you will see at table 2, they speak of up to December 2018 with projections January 2019 up down to March 2019. In terms of updated information, I can share with the Honourable Chamber that in terms of the current revenue, preliminary information received from the Accountant General indicates that the revenue for the period 1st of April 2018 to February the 28th, 2019 was $2,569.4 million, an increase of $139 million, or 5.7% more than current revenue for the same period in the fiscal year 2017-2018. And this is good. It goes on, and I'm sure that honorable members will be aware of this, that corporation tax, property tax, that these realize $918.4 million, which is $94.7 million more. This is up to February, or 11.5% more than that collected for the corresponding period in 2018. Corporation taxes, the revenue garnered from that increased by 40 million, and property taxes increased by 27.7 million. In terms of indirect taxes, there's an increase of this in revenue of 22.8 million over the corresponding period in 2017-2018. And receipts of VAT totaled 838.9 million, an increase of 48.2 million over the corresponding period 2017 and 18. Import duties decreased by 7.6 million, but an amount of 50 million was collected for the fuel tax and 26.6 million for the garbage and sewage contribution, and 69.1 million for the foreign exchange fee. So that is sort of updated information, which obviously will be changed in the final document. In terms of expenditure, current expenditure exclusive of amortization of 342.9 million decreased by 364 million. And this is mainly due to the debt restructuring, which I mentioned earlier, Mr. President. Presently, the fiscal surplus of 109.7 million represent a 1.1% of GDP at market prices. And the present primary balance represents a surplus of 471.4 million at this point in time. Mr. President, if members look at the tables 4 through to 10, I believe, they can see in terms of the trends, in terms of the increased revenue that I spoke about. That is there on table 8 and 10, I believe. And these tables are extremely important in terms of identifying at short notice, quickly able to reference to see what is happening in terms of government expenditure, in terms of the approved estimates, in terms of the revised estimates, and in terms of what is being planned in the new financial year 2019-2020. Mr. President, I mentioned in my opening remarks about the introduction of the budget, the budgetary statement, into the process in terms of indicating how some of the revenue will be obtained by way of taxation or otherwise. And this has been well ventilated in terms of the budgetary measures. And a lot has been said, certainly in terms of taxation as it relates to the poor and who will really benefit. I believe the first thing I perhaps should speak about is in terms of the personal income tax. And I think it is recognized that this was a burden on some persons, and government has recognized this. Indeed, I believe in the budget last June, I stand to be corrected, in terms of the tax bands, they were adjusted. And now they're being adjusted again, but this time in the direction in which I think all honorable members in this chamber will be well pleased. Plan is that persons working up to $25,000 will now be entitled to reverse tax credit of $1,300 annually. This, I believe, extended up to persons who were earning less than 18,000. It is now being extended to 25,000. And indeed, persons working for up to $35,000 will not be paying income tax. And the tax bands, which currently on which a rate of 16%, 33.5%, and 40% are applied, will be abolished on July the 1st. The first tax band will be $50,000 and under, on which the rate of 12.5% will now be introduced. And the second band will be those earning incomes between $50,000 50,000 and over, on which 33.5% instead of the 40% will now be applied. As I said, the reverse tax credit will be extended to persons who are earning $25,000 or less. And I believe, Mr. President, this is clearly aimed at those persons in the society who are less well off. And this certainly is giving them ease in terms of taxation, and clearly is directed at those who are less better off in the society. In terms of property tax, this is expected to yield about $61 million. The tax on vacant land will go from 0.8% to 1% for lots over 4,000 square feet, certainly in an effort to encourage persons, rather than leaving vacant lots overgrown and unkempt, and providing comfort for vectors like rats and other rodents, that to develop their lots and try to make some money out of them rather than paying increasing land taxes. For properties valued between $451,000 to $850,000, the rate goes from 0.45% to 0.7%. And Mr. President, for properties valued over $850,000, that is your category, the rate goes from 0.8% to 1%. For the cap increases, where the cap on it told you would pay up to $60,000. And indeed, for non-residential owners, it goes from 0.7% to 0.98%. Indeed, I said this is intended to raise $61.9 million in terms of revenue. There will also be increases in terms of the interest on withholding taxes, and in an effort to yield a further $70 million, there'll be changes in terms of the items on the VAT, which removed from the zero-rated schedule, and this is available in terms of the information. So again, there's expected to be some gains there in terms of that adjustment to the schedule in terms of VAT. When it comes to the villa and the room rate levies and the hotel aspects, government has made some changes in terms of the villas and the room rate levies to yield an additional $15 million as is anticipated. And in terms of gambling and the lotteries, government is expecting to raise another $17 million there to offset some of the decreases in terms of the changes related to the income tax bands. They'll also be looking at in terms of the commercial water rates, and those were in a nutshell some of the main issues. The matter of bus fares going to $3.50 has caused some consternation, but I believe many honourable members in this chamber well recognize that there was plans, and that certainly the outgoing government had within its possession the recommendation to increase bus fares to $5. And I believe there was some measure of, I don't want to call it anger, that the Barbados Labour Party government has only increased the bus fares to $3.50. We recognize that this can be quite significant for some members of our society and those who have to use public transport. I'm coming to that, Mr. President. But certainly there's been this announcement in terms of discounted fares, persons being encouraged to buy books of 10, 15, 14, and 20 tickets, and which will be discounted. They can probably end up paying $3 instead of $3.50 per ride. And I understand the feeling. I mean, persons using the bus to get to work, to get from work, some people have to take two buses, have to transfer from one bus to another, and it is nothing to be taken lightly. But you have a situation where the transport board was earning, I believe, roughly about $25 million in revenue per year, and government having to provide $60, $70 million some years. And that is certainly an untenable situation. Government has not privatized the transport system as such, but endeavoring to recognizing it will still have to assist the transport board. but also recognizing that there will need for additional income. There's talk also in terms of the fleet. We've had difficulties in the transport system in terms of dealing with the transport board in terms of the shortages, buses down for repairs, for a lot of spare parts. The issues we've had, I mentioned in my earlier presentation, related to contracts offered to various entities in terms of repairing the buses and what happened in the end. And I think the government is looking at the entire process, recognizing that there needs to be an efficient, well-ordered service, one that is reliable, and one that, in spite of the challenges, that eventually you reach a situation where the average Barbadian will be satisfied with the service that is provided. So that is as it relates to the Transport Board. Mr. President, I spoke of the Barbados Economic Recovery and Transformation Plan. And indeed, Mr. President, members will be aware that there is a monitoring committee which has been put in place to ensure that targets are met and that we are on stream with the targets that we have set in terms of this program. And I'm happy to report, I'm not gloating, it's still early days yet, but certainly by the end of December 2018, we had met, that is Barbados had met the criteria in all areas in terms of performance criteria. There was talk of a flaw on central government primary balance, and although the revenue collection was below the target, the reduction in expenditure more than compensated, allowing the primary balance minimum target to be surpassed. In fact, the target was 257, and the actual was 348. There is a pledge to not accumulate any further central government external debt arrears, and the target was 0, and certainly by the end of December, the actual was 0. In terms of the transfer of grants to public institutions, it applies to a list of 33 public institutions. Today, the transfers to these public institutions were 486 million. The target was 495. So certainly in terms of transfers, the target was achieved. In terms of the ceiling on the public debt, as of December, following the successful restructuring, the stock of total debt was 12.8 thousand million, versus the expected, the cap was 13, so you're below that. In terms of the central bank, on the net domestic assets of the central bank, there was 1.763 million versus a ceiling of 1.97, not one, sorry, 1,000, sorry, Mr. President, 1,977 million, they made a mistake, they have a point. They have a full stop between 1,000. In terms of the net international reserves, in December it was 830 versus the 531. And of course, the Honourable Senator said, the reserves have been boosted by $350 million of loans from the IDB and CDB. That is not a secret. But in addition, the suspension of the external debt payments has also assisted in the process. So all in all, the targets have been met as of December 2018. The government was supposed to implement certain legislative acts. The Public Finance Management Act was one of the requirements, and I think all honourable senators were delighted in approving of that. And similarly, the Planning and Development Bill 2019 was passed in January, and this was also part of the criteria. So we are doing quite well in terms of the targets and our benchmarks, but I've said no need to gloat. It is early days yet, and there is still some work to be done, So, Mr. President, that is just an overview in terms of the overall estimates. But of course, the estimates relate to the various ministries and the programs that are taking place in those ministries. And Mr. President, technology can be bothersome. Of course, I have responsibility for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade. So I will no doubt start with that ministry. I will of course speak to some of the other ministries, and in the course of this debate, other honorable senators on this side will enhance, elaborate on some of the things that I've said, and in fact speak on new items within ministries that they are involved in or see themselves shadowing. I've seen one here, a very keen educator who is part of the Ministry of Education, and I have no doubt that he will enlighten this chamber in terms of the fascinating work being planned by his ministry during the course of this financial year. But in terms of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade, people often ask, what is the ministry? What does it really do? It doesn't give out jobs. It doesn't give out contracts. What is it? What is it? It is not politically attractive, but it is a very important ministry. I think those who recognize the structure of government recognize that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is almost like it's like a wheel, spoke of a wheel, where it's at the center. And the various spikes go to the various ministries. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs, its work or lack of work, impacts positively or negatively on every ministry in this country, everyone. Be it in terms of fostering good relations and interfacing with foreign governments, on Barbados' position in political, in terms of trade, economic, cultural, and other interests, representing Barbados at important multilateral negotiations that set international legal rules and indeed trade policy as it obtains with the WTO and WIPO and these entities. WIPO, property. Mr. President, I don't know this thing about white. Some people are obsessed with the color white. I have not. In terms of assisting and coordination efforts by other governments and ministries and agencies and by the private sector, in terms of its role in formulating trade and foreign policy and supporting the implementation of programs to bring trade, investment, capital, and technology, indeed, technical assistance to Barbados, protecting Barbados' trade rights through negotiation or dispute settlement procedures, delineating and establishing Barbados' exclusive economic zone, as was done with Trinidad 10 years ago. We've established in terms of St. Lucia and St. Vincent, and still not working on it in terms of going forward as it relates to Guyana and Suriname. And protecting and promoting, of course, the welfare of Barbadians overseas. And I'm sure Honourable Senator on the other side, who is looking at me, is all too familiar with this process and the role that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs plays in terms of the welfare of Barbadian citizens who reside overseas, perhaps in the United Kingdom. I see her pointing to Senator Grant, but I don't know that he is very much involved in that, certainly from a different perspective in trying to bring them here to spend money in this country. Then, over the past year, the ministry has been involved, certainly very actively, and I'll start at home and then go out from there, in terms of the CARICOM Relations Unit, and the whole aspect of regional integration and cooperation, and servicing and representing the country at various meetings, several meetings. And topical issue this year, over the last couple of months, would have been the matter of contingent rights. And I believe we've heard members of opposition party in this country venting their spleen in terms of contingent rights and who should come or who should not be allowed to come to Barbados. So in terms of the CARICOM, in terms of the CARICOM single market and economy, the ministry plays a very important role in conjunction with, of course, the Prime Minister's office. And I think members will be well aware now in terms within this region of the issues and the role of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the matters, Mr. President, I said an opposition entity within this country. I never accused the honourable member of venting his spleen. I don't even know if he has a spleen left.
You're not referring to anyone here.
Indeed, I wasn't speaking to anyone in this chamber.
I would assume so.
Yes, Mr. President, I certainly wasn't. I was about to mention the whole issue of Venezuela, on which is the CARICOM is involved right now in terms of trying to carve out a process of dialogue, recognizing that we see the Caribbean as a zone of peace, that we believe in the UN Convention, certainly in terms of non-interference, non-intervention, and the non-use, certainly, of arms in going into countries, etc. We are having, I think members will be aware that there have been negotiations in CARICOM. 3 countries have been identified as the lead countries in this process. St. Kitts and Nevis, which is chaired by the Prime Minister, who is the current chair of CARICOM, the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, and the Prime Minister of Barbados. And those are the 3 that have been mandated by CARICOM, by the heads of government. Most recently at the St. Kitts Intersessional meeting, it was agreed that this is how the process will be led, that those 3 prime ministers would be involved in the discussions. They've been to the United Nations, they've met with the Secretary General of the UN. They took the opportunity to meet with some leaders and also ambassadors of countries. They've been to Montevideo to meet with the Mexicans and the Uruguayans, and looking at the whole process, the Montevideo mechanism, which speaks to the need for dialogue, the needs for negotiation, commitment, and implementation of a process to bring about an election. So that is where the process is. Honourable members will notice that there's been a sort of pullback or retraction in terms of the comments that were formerly made by entities. For example, the European Union, which I believe it was back in February, gave some ultimatum that there must be this in 8 days or else. And February has passed and March has passed. And there's seemingly a stepping back where more and more countries have come out openly, certainly within the Lima Group, and stated their reluctance and reticence in terms of any intervention, certainly military intervention, into Venezuela. So the process is a very fluid one. I believe honourable members some of them would know that there was a meeting with some of Guaido's senior people, and indeed by Mr. Guaido via teleconference on Saturday evening, and that was held here. It was the Canadian government which facilitated the entire process. Of course, while this was going on, there are leaders who were in Florida having a meeting with the President of the United States. And I don't think that members should feel that they necessarily had anything one to do with the other. I believe from what I can garner, the discussion centered, I was told, indeed, on trade and surrounding trade and building relationships, certainly in terms of the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative and the Caribbean Basin Trade Initiative. Certainly that is what I've been able to garner so far, reading the statements from the Prime Ministers of Jamaica and indeed of St. Lucia. The process continues this week, however, where CARICOM Secretary General and Prime Minister Timothy Harris will be going to Quito, where they were meeting between the Lima Group, the EU, and we have been invited to participate in this process, looking to bring about a resolution to the process through negotiations, through looking at how we get to an election. And indeed, it is a very sensitive discussion, very sensitive, and obviously you have to involve communication between both sides. So that is the CARICOM position in terms of that. And that is the main thing that is engaged in our attention. The issues of Brexit and how it would affect trade from the CARICOM region, these took up quite a bit of time in terms of discussions, and a way has been found in terms of an agreement, and I believe both ministers of trade signed off on this agreement in St. Lucia last week. Having said that, there's still the matters of the ACP and the Cotonou Agreement, which expires in 2020. And we have been in serious negotiations with the European Union, in spite of our other issues in terms of blacklisting, in terms of the facilitation of trade, etc., and utilization of the European Partnership Agreement, which we have not utilized as yet, certainly in terms of the Eastern Caribbean, and certainly in terms of Barbados. We have matters outstanding in terms of establishing of phytosanitary standards and other matters. So that is in terms of Caribbean, in terms of CARICOM, in terms of ACP, in terms of Brexit. In terms of bilateral cooperation, we have moved over the last 10 months in terms of the closeness of Barbados to some countries in the region. We attended an OECS meeting, their meeting in June. And obviously the OES has been able to achieve things among those 7 countries that we in the wider CARICOM seem to be still wrestling with. And indeed, it was felt that perhaps Barbados can also, and certainly in terms of tourism, certainly in terms of trade, we have a lot and we certainly benefit in terms of the OECS being in terms of our exports, and certainly in terms of tourism, benefit from the OECS. And so there's going to be a plan to try to forge a deeper and stronger relationship between Barbados and the OECS going forward. Suriname, the Prime Minister paid an official visit to Suriname in October, and this is a country that is certainly in terms of CARICOM has become much more involved. And in that visit, they saw numerous areas where they could be, in terms of trade, in terms of communication, recognizing that we need to have some sort of, for trade facilitation, we need, in terms of shipping, we need to be able to find that bringing stuff from parts of the Caribbean can create tedious, and certainly looking in Suriname in terms of providing ships that can trade from Suriname to Barbados and vice versa. They are interested in our limestone. We are interested in a number of things that they have there, be it silica, be it sand for construction, and certainly fruits and vegetables. And there's an agreement was signed, and as a matter of fact, on April 1st, there will be, we've established a special ambassador to go to Suriname from April the 1st to work on this process in terms of increasing the trade and other opportunities for cooperation, be it in agriculture, be it in tourism, be it in industry, be it in shipping, and certainly in terms of air services. Guyana, we have also had very good meetings with in terms of the president, again, in terms of similar things, but the issue of his illness and I wanted to be careful in terms of the presence of a government, if the government is still intact when there will be elections, so that is on hold. Cuba has still continued to be a very good partner for Barbados, and they're looking to work with us. They're focusing now in terms of health and looking at the issue of Alzheimer in Barbados. The Cubans have done a lot of work in terms of Alzheimer's, and we are seeing a rising, increasing number of persons with Alzheimer's in Barbados, and we think there's a lot that we can learn from the Cubans in terms of their approach to the treatment and care of persons with Alzheimer's. And also they're doing some very interesting work in terms of diabetes and lung cancer, and these are the issues that we will be involved in. We participated in a fair trade exhibition in Cuba. Going further afield, we have made it clear that in terms of the Barbados's relationship with countries, we're looking to strengthen and deepen our relationship with current countries with which we have relationships, but recognizing the changes and the fluidity within the global system, where partners who at one time were very committed and supportive of you have drifted for whatever reason, sometimes because of viewing situations differently. That way a void is created that certainly developing countries like Barbados need to survive, always remembering that we are committed to the fact that we see ourselves as friends of all and satellites of none. So where a void is created, we certainly have to look at creating additional opportunities in new areas. And certainly in terms of our foreign affairs, we are broadening the scope. We're looking to East countries in Eastern Europe, certainly in the issue of the EU blacklisting. A country like Romania was extremely supportive of CARICOM and Barbados in terms of the matters with the EU. And traditionally, this is not a country that we'll be looking at. This is how we have to make the shift. And in terms of spreading our wings, we recognize that Africa is vitally important and most definitely is part of our process for this year. We are looking forward to establishing a mission in Ghana. We are looking at doing one also in Panama, recognizing that these are two very important locations for us in terms of establishing trade relationships, in terms of tourism. I believe Barbados is equidistant between Ghana and Central America, and we believe that we need to start looking at these countries and indeed at other countries, looking perhaps at another country in Africa, perhaps South Africa, perhaps Kenya. These are the things that we are looking at, and certainly strengthening relationship with countries like South Korea, Japan, Vietnam, Singapore, looking for opportunities. In terms of China, we've signed the Belt and Road Initiative recently. I know that some our neighbors to the north are not terribly happy, but again, Barbados has to do what is in Barbados' particular interests. And we are mindful of the issues that have occurred in Indian Ocean countries like Kenya and certainly Sri Lanka in terms of the assistance and being unable to pay. But I believe that historically, Barbados, except for a slight hiccup over the past 10 years, has been committed to sticking to and paying our bills. So I think generally, globally, those are the main things that I think that we should speak about in terms of health, of foreign affairs. But in terms of the plans for this year, other plans, I mentioned the establishment of new missions. I spoke to there's a plan afoot in terms of modernizing the ministry's infrastructural to make a use of this technology. We have not been looking at that. We are seriously considering we need to look at a unitization agreement in terms of Trinidad, in terms of the delimitation. We recognize both countries have blocks. Both have been positive in terms of oil reserves. We have to be aware that one of our blocks borders that of one of Trinidad and Tobago, and in these days of technological advances, I'm sure the Honourable Leader of the Opposition in this chamber will recognize that there's always a possibility for someone in Trinidad to dig vertically and then horizontally and across that line of delimitation. And so there's need urgently for us to have a unitization agreement establishing that both countries will benefit from what each one extracts. And these are things that we're looking at. I've mentioned the need to do a delimitation agreement between Barbados and Suriname, and indeed between Barbados and Guyana. I mentioned the issue of South Korea, the interest in Barbados and the Caribbean, and we are planning to host the Korea Caribbean Forum. South Korea has been traditionally hosting this, and we are seeing a time to bring them to the region, especially to Barbados, to see how we can perhaps benefit from their assistance. Countries like Morocco have reached out in terms of offering assistance. I believe the Ministry of Agriculture gets tons of fertilizer from Morocco free of charge to be distributed in the agriculture sector in Barbados. And they're looking at other areas. They're interested in terms of further assistance, culturally, in terms of tourism, in terms of the diplomatic school, in terms of providing a facility where Barbadians can go to Morocco and have access to the training there. All members are aware of the next year, the 2020 gathering, and of course the ministry has established a unit and is working assiduously with its overseas missions to make this a success. And I guess, all in all, those are the matters which the Ministry of Foreign Affairs will be dealing with in the next financial year. Mr. President, tourism and international transport is vitally important in terms of the economic stability and the economic development of Barbados. And we see it as a very important one in terms of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We work very closely and would like to work even closer at times with the Ministry of Tourism and International Transport. But regrettably, in Barbados, still there's this issue, this silo effect among a number of ministries, which has to be addressed. I believe I've raised it before, and it is something that we will have to look at, where oftentimes the communication between ministries is not what we would expect it to be in a small society where we're all working towards one final solution. But I'm saying that in general, not targeting tourism, but that applies to generally all the ministries in terms of tardiness, in terms of responses, and it needs to be dealt with. But in terms of tourism, we've seen increasing numbers of visitors in terms of cruise ship passengers, and there's no complaint about that. In terms of visitor spend, that seems to be increasing, not at the level which we would expect at this point in time, but rising. I gather that there's interest now in Lufthansa in terms of bringing more German tourists into Barbados. But we have, in terms of the development, our hotel sector has been suffering in terms of the numbers of beds available. And we have not been making a lot of progress in this area. And certainly this year, we'll be pushing. There's the issue, the vaccine or semi-vaccine issue, sandals. And I believe this was very well ventilated by the Honourable Prime Minister last night, and certainly in some of the media, in terms of the concessions that were granted to sandals by the previous government, where we are attempting or trying to honour them, but are now requiring even more. And I think the Honourable Leader of the Opposition was probably the person, this is his favorite area, this whole issue of these concessions, and a situation where more is given, more is requested. I can't say just requested. And there comes a time where both sides would have to stop and take stock. And hopefully common sense will prevail, and this matter will be resolved in terms of Sanders' further development. I believe it's a beaches property in Barbados. The Hilton, the previous government had made plans in terms of selling the Hilton. I believe it was for $150 million, barely enough that would have covered the debts. The government has now negotiated a new arrangement where the government will maintain ownership, and an entity will be investing $40 million in the whole process of refurbishing of the hotel. And of course, there'll be a sharing of profits. So the government will be indeed making more in terms of profit in the end and retaining the project. The Hyatt, which has been contentious, there's movement in terms of getting the Hyatt project started. Indeed, there are plans it was felt that in terms of the limited area, that it was restrictive in terms of provision of services. And the plan is to extend the footprint for the Hyatt, and the government is looking at the compulsory acquisition of a certain center in that area to make provision for expansion that would allow the Hyatt to have 350 rooms. Sandals Hotel, a project that has been going on for some time with Chinese funding, part funding, and the government recognizes that this is a major capital expenditure and affects our debt status, and certainly the RFPs for new equity investors or sale will be going out shortly. Already entities have expressed interest in this project. Caribbean, which looks like an eyesore on Hastings, I gather that there will be a brand new 170-room hotel there within a not too distant future. And Blue Horizon is to be refurbished and extended to have 189 rooms. So things are looking good in terms of the provision of hotel rooms in Barbados. And I'm sure that my colleague, Senator Grant, will certainly elaborate and parade in this matter, he being the president of an entity that is involved in this entire process. Meanwhile, the government is serious. We've looked at the whole process of development. We've looked at the contour and the environs of the Carlisle Bay Center, recognizing that it is indeed one of the most panoramic views or beaches, certainly in this part of the world, and that it has areas that can be further developed. And I believe that Senator Grant will certainly speak in terms of the Tourism Investment Forum being planned for late in April to invite major investors to look at areas that have been identified that can be looked at in terms of development, be it for hotels, be it for condos, along that stretch, the Carlisle Bay Center. And Mr. President, if you saw the pictorial representation of what is possible, I believe you would be shocked. I move on to the Grantley Adams International Airport, and with the increasing numbers of visitors to the island, the increasing number of persons traversing that airport, there'll be needs for expansion and indeed further expansion. There's a new departure launch, an extension. There's an ongoing plan now of paving the runway, sorry. But also the government recognizes that major countries, major cities in the world, airports are not owned by governments. Indeed, the Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris is not owned by government. Gatwick has been owned by a Nigerian for some time now. And certainly that is the movement in the Caribbean, in Jamaica. Both airports are owned by private entities, and that is the trend. And indeed, the move in Barbados will be to look at a leasing and expansion arrangement. And you will hear more about this in the not too distant future. There's the vexing issue of the introduction of the kiosks, which the government has been trying. I mean, it started with the previous government trying to introduce it and have met some resistance as expected from at various levels. It is always a thing of introducing something new, and where persons who are accustomed to doing things manually recognize that the machine might replace them, and not that they might be displaced from work, but they might be displaced to another work area where their services are required. And so there's that resistance. And then, of course, there's the issues of technical faults and technical issues. And I believe we started off again in earnest in January in terms of the utilization of these kiosks, but we ran into problems in terms of the servers and the issues of security over the last week. But this is being worked out. Mr. President, in terms of the whole matter of customs, that is an area which the government is most urgently seeking to address. In terms of the other house, there would have been a provision made, I believe a week or two ago, in terms of the allocation of $700,000 to deal with that whole system. It was the last time the Barbados Labour Party formed the government in 2006. The Asikuda Plus system was introduced into Barbados. And I'm sure the honourable member, the honourable leader of the opposition, remembers this because no doubt he was active in his union leadership. I believe he was he was representing about 22 people in terms of this movement to Asikuda. Sorry, Mr. Chair, Mr. President, 100, and he corrects me. In the matter of Asikuda Plus, where we were boasting, having difficulty bringing it into place, it came into place. We were boasting that we were among one of the first countries in the world that was moving to Asikuda Plus. 10 years later, we have the distinction of being one of the few countries that still use Asikuda Plus, where everyone else is going now to Asikuda World. And we need to move in this direction very quickly. It provides for greater efficiency and less discretion to those who are operating the system. And I'm sure the honourable member will be very supportive of the moves to introduce Asikuda World and will encourage his members to work assiduously with us to ensure that it is a success in terms of its implementation. Mr. President, the Ministry of Energy and Water Resources, which is one that quite important, and certainly from the point of view of the water resources, has been quite topical. I spoke earlier in terms of the South Coast Sewage Project and the problems that they've had there in terms of the repairs. They've been able to repair the gravity line. They've constructed a temporary outflow. We've known the issues where the beach had to be closed for a period of time to allow the construction of this outflow. The Graham Hall swamp channels have been cleared. They've upgraded the plant filters, and the work still continues, and it is markedly improved. But that is not the end. The government needs to make provision now for upgrade of that South Coast Sewage Treatment Plant to a tertiary treatment plant, with the utilization of the water perhaps for agriculture or in terms of flushing toilets. But I know in Barbados there's an aversion to the whole concept of utilizing treated water. When Paris has been in existence for over 100 years, in the city of Paris, they've been using tertiary treated water. But we are getting there slowly, and before we get there, a lot of work will be needed in terms of upgrading that plant, and indeed the Bridgetown plant. The irony of it, sometimes we get assistance from foreign entities, be it funding or grant funding or loans, and we are constrained in terms of the selection processes. And I believe that this, looking at the files and looking at the background information, the construction of the South Coast project was one of these such entities where the decision should have been made back in 1995, 1993 to move to a tertiary treatment plant. At that time would have been much cheaper. And when you reflect that the Bridgetown sewage treatment plant would have been constructed in the 70s, and in terms of technology, it is more advanced than the South Coast sewage plant, in a situation where you had to be constrained by the loan entity that was providing the funding in terms of this issue of the least cost choice. And that is where we are, where we're going to have to seriously look at upgrading it to a tertiary treatment plant. Work on the Bridgetown plant has been done over the past year and will have to be continued. It was in a terrible state. I believe that all members would have seen the photos in the newspaper. Those chambers have been brought into use, but it will certainly need to be upgraded. The matter of water augmentation and the water shortages, this is a matter that is being addressed in terms of mains replacement plan across the island. This ministry also has responsibility for the national energy policy. This was updated recently. The initial one had been prepared in 2006. And we all know that there's a movement of work in terms of this country, in terms of moving towards the utilization of renewable energy. It was a splurge of activity 2 years ago in terms of the encouragement of photovoltaics. But now that seems to have leveled off, and obviously will need additional stimulation at this point in time. But we are aiming in terms, and I'll choose my words carefully here, in terms of carbon neutrality by 2030. I shall not dwell into the issues of whether or not Barbados will be all renewable energy by 2030. I will say I see carbon neutrality, and I'm sure my colleague from the other side will certainly agree with that choice of word, of language. The sale of the BNTCL is not being considered presently. That is going off. I believe members will also recognize the issues that were at play there. Sol has joined or been bought or been part of a new company, and perhaps that would have sweetened the deal, but it is no longer obviously necessary in terms of the process. The Ministry of Environment and Beautification and the whole issue of the SBRC and the contract that was entered into the SBRC, where it was changed, the contract, the initial proposed contract of 2008 was changed in June 2009 to allow the entity to be charged, to be able to receive, to agree to a project in terms of payment, where you agree to terms where Barbados was not reaching the tonnage of garbage, but you were indeed paying and agreed to pay for volume of garbage that you were not producing, if we can use producing garbage. But it also spoke to the issue that as part of that contract, there was supposed to be a composting facility, which has never been constructed. And as part of that, the entity was supposed to do that, to facilitate composting and the whole glorious thing about biomass and the utilization of biomass in terms of a means of generating electricity, and this component was never done. So that whole contract is being renegotiated, and I'm told that the government should end up with substantial savings in terms of the new agreement. Cahill and the whole plasma gasification, I guess, that has come to a gaseous end. And the outstanding matter still from the last administration is the matter of the 5 or 6 story new Sanitation Services Authority building in the middle of St. Thomas on a hill, which at exorbitant cost and agreement, and even now cannot be occupied because major refurbishment is still needed of this completed building. At a time we were building this structure while we were hovering around with 8 and 10 garbage trucks to fulfill the needs of the entire island, and which resulted in piles of garbage throughout the island. Mr. President, I believe the government at that time had a true ball in terms of construction of buildings at whatever price, even if there were if there was any plan for them, or if there was no plan to utilize them fully. But certainly, it was a building boom of a sort that I don't think that we would need to see in Barbados again anytime soon in terms of how it was done. There's still the matter, the Ministry of the Environment and Beautification, the whole matter of the new botanical gardens, and I believe persons would have seen the initial plans in terms of the clearing of Waterford Bottom, creating this panorama, which you can only envisage, Mr. President, the boulevard effect. Thanks for the use of the word. My honorable colleague, Mr. President. And of course, the work that was started by the Barbados Labour Party when lost in office in terms of the Constitution River and the surroundings, and the dredging and the clearing and the widening and providing beautification that persons can walk, and benches where the Honourable Leader of the Opposition could go perhaps with his grandchildren when he gets tired of the Senate from time, or when he is replaced, and spend the evenings. It's a good time to, Mr. President, that was a good time to have a glass of water. Let me move, Mr. President, and I'm trying to move against the clock. I really want to finish by one. Health and wellness. Health and wellness, and we know the story of the QEH. We'll have to wait to see how it changes now. Government has made a provision for the QEH. I believe it's 129 million, in addition to what they are achieving, into what they are getting from the levy that was imposed last year. So we will see the outcome of that in terms of the QEH. I believe the board is trying to work assiduously in controlling the issues of procurement and the awarding of contract and servicing of equipment. And I believe that the procurement manager has resigned, and I last heard that the CEO has gone on sick leave. I believe he's on leave. Perhaps the Honourable Senator in this Honourable Chamber might be able to enlighten me as to shed some light, perhaps, Mr. President, because I'd be delighted to find out if while he's on this sick leave, he is playing any golf with any former member, playing golf with any former member of a cabinet of Barbados, or of any relationship to any member within this chamber. Mr. President, the expansion of A&E has been spoken about in the Prime Minister in her budget in June, almost immediately after coming to office, and recognizing the situation, the sad situation that's still obtained there in terms of the waiting time. And I've gathered that the project has started. Already they've instituted a system where there is medical triage. Formerly it was nurses who did the triage. They've moved to the system that is more common globally in terms of doctors doing a triage of persons as they come to the accident emergency, identifying those who need to be seen and need to be seen in a certain time, to try to reduce this long waiting period for people who need to be seen in a shorter period of time. They've also established, I believe it's called a minor emergency unit, which deals with things that oftentimes in the past, people with nail punctures or lacerations would be there for several hours being waited to be attended to while the emergencies were sorted out. So they've created a minor emergency unit. Ideally, this should be done in the polyclinics, and I believe the intention is that this will be done in the Winston Scott and the David Thompson polyclinics when they get up and rolled in terms of extended hours, extended opening hours. In addition, I know that they've established a ward upstairs of the A&E where those persons who have to wait for results or wait sometimes to be reviewed for long periods and they take up space in the actual A&E are being housed. Regrettably, the issue of the abandonment of the elderly continues, and persons who've come, elderly persons especially, who've been brought to the QH and they have been treated and are ready to be discharged. Oftentimes their relatives indicate that they're in no position to look after them anymore or to take them home. That causes occupation of beds on the wards, and then when patients who need to be admitted have to be held in A&E for several hours, sometimes days, because there are no beds for them to be placed in on the wards. And this process has to be addressed. Years ago, the Barbados Labour Party government established, I believe, Mr. President, I happened to be the Minister of Health at the time, an alternative care of the elderly program where government provided for private nursing homes, so government paid them, and provision is indeed in these estimates for that to be accommodated. Those are the ones who just required basic care, and these entities were required, and it was regulated by the ministry in terms of having nursing staff, in terms of nutritional state, having a doctor visit, and the government would pay, the Ministry of Health would pay these providers to look after these people so that you move them out of the system, so you were able then to move persons from the QH to the geriatric system and into the alternative care of the elderly program if they could be accommodated and they could be managed. For some reason, we discovered recently that the funds, although approved, were not being utilized, and the ministry is moving assiduously to deal with this. They found out that they could accommodate up to 240 people, but they were only 170 people were being in the system at that point in time, yet the funds had been provided. So hopefully this will address the bed situation, at least in the short term. But certainly we have to plan globally in terms of addressing this situation, which is annoying, vexing, and indeed recognizing that these people were the builders of Barbados and in the latter years need to be looked after properly, and certainly would have done and made sacrifices for their relatives and then to be abandoned. The medical aid scheme is still in place, and this provides obviously for persons who require treatment outside of Barbados or treatment in Barbados that is not available at the QH. The decentralization of the ambulance service, I believe we are back to square one. It was in 2005 that we started the Arch Hall process where we deployed ambulances to the north of the island over time, and through the excuse of refurbishment of the fire station, I believe that has been completed, but the ambulances have not been allowed to return. And this certainly helps in terms of the response time in an emergency. The time it takes to get an ambulance from Bridgetown to St. Lucie, vis-a-vis having that ambulance in Arch Hall and it going to St. Lucie and getting that person to treatment. So it is something that the government seriously has to address, and the possibility of deploying. I see in the estimates that there's provision for an ambulance this year. They will certainly need to look at possibly deploying an ambulance at the David Thompson Polyclinic if it is going to be open 24 hours a day. There, Mr. President, there's one issue that I want to raise here, and it is in terms of HIV/AIDS in Barbados, a treatment program. Barbados has made all. Barbados has done extremely well in terms of the management of HIV/AIDS. I believe it was one of the first countries in the world. It was certainly one of the first countries that made antiretroviral medication available to persons who needed it. We have done that continually since 2002. Both, whichever government has been there, has done that. Of course, the medication is oftentimes expensive. And we've managed in terms of World Bank loans over the period to continue our program. And had major injections through the President's Fund, the PEPFAR Fund, I believe when it was President Bush who started this. And we benefited, and certainly in terms of the development of our lab, the new laboratory, that we benefited from the PEPFAR funds. It is troubling that recently we've expected that the grant would continue until 2021, but there's now a move afoot to curtail this in September this year. And I think there's something that government will have to look at carefully, especially the Ministry of Health, in terms of the advocacy and the importance of having this funding maintained. And it is something that I think that we need to pay attention to in the coming months, because the removal of that grant funding will certainly have some effects, major effects, on our ability to care and look after those persons who suffer from HIV/AIDS. Mr. President, I was going to speak a bit about the Ministry of Innovation and Science Technology, but I know that the Honourable Minister is just raring to go, and I will not attempt to steal any of her thunder. Neither would I do the same in terms of education. Suffice it to say that in terms of the University of West Indies and the outstanding debt over the years, that we have come to an agreement. We've been paying, and I'm certain that the Honourable Senator Springer, when he speaks, will be delighted to speak about this, and the establishment and opening of Ross University Medical School here, and the possibility that they might be encouraged to develop a nursing facility in Barbados for the training of nurses, not only to practice in the region, but certainly recognizing that there's a global shortage of nurses, and that the Philippines have used it strategically in terms of training nurses, and in terms of the country benefiting from the tremendous remittances of the thousands of Filipino nurses that are now all over the world. And I believe that Barbados is now looking in terms of some nurses again, because we are seemingly short again. Mr. President, I think that I have covered quite a bit. I know that there are a lot of other members keen. I promise not to go beyond to detain the chamber beyond 1 o'clock, because I know we have a tight timeline in terms of this debate. Suffice it to say, I will mention the $103 million plan for road works in the next 2 years in terms of Barbados. I have spoken early in terms of the bus fares and the electric buses. And in terms of agriculture, I know that we're making progress in terms of expansion of the black belly sheep program, and looking at the whole use of the medical marijuana and putting in place a framework for that to be available in Barbados, for use in Barbados. Mr. President, I believe that over the past 10 months, the government has really been extremely busy. I would also like to thank honourable colleagues on the other side in terms of their assistance, recognizing the legislative agenda of the government has been quite rapid, and we have really been trying your patience more often than not in terms of getting things done. I certainly appreciate the cooperation and the assistance which has been rendered from time to time by my honourable colleagues on the other side, and I certainly look forward to their keen participation in this debate, and for us to share ideas and share hopes for our country, our beloved Barbados. Mr. President, I am obliged to you. Thank you. Sorry, I'd like to move that the appropriation bill be read a second time.
Question is, that this appropriation bill be now read a second time. Yes. I recognize Senator Franklin, but it is also a convenient hour for, it's 1 o'clock.
He wants to speak. That's what he wants to speak.
If you want to break the national.
That's what I want to do. That's what I was trying to do for one. Mr. President, I beg to move that this sitting be suspended for 1 hour until 2 p.m. for lunch.
Question is that this chamber will be now suspended until 2 o'clock for 1 hour. All honorable members in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, please say no. We are now on suspension for lunch and be back at 2.
Let's go for 1.